So welcome everyone. This is the question and answer for the Scholarly Editions program, Scholarly Editions and Translations program from Friday, September 15th at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. We're going to be having folks ask questions for this session in the chat, and then myself, Suha, will be answering questions as they come in, and we'll answer them orally, and they'll also be transcribed later when we post this onto YouTube. And so you will have a chance to see the answers or come back to the answers if you need to. But for now, I'll just introduce myself and let Suha and Amy introduce themselves. So my name is Jason Bofetti. I'm the program officer that oversees the Scholarly Editions and Translations program, and I have for a few years now. My own field is political theory. I've worked at the endowment now since 2008. I've run this program maybe for the last 7 or 8 years. Let me turn it over now to Suha.
Hello, everyone. I'm a program officer in the Division of Research. I've been with NEH since 2020. My background is in comparative literature and translation studies. I'll be very happy to help you with my colleagues, Jason and Amy, and to answer your questions. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Amy Trotter. I'm the program analyst for Scholarly Editions and Translations, as well as a couple of other programs in the Division of Research. We're happy to have you here today. Thanks so much for coming, and looking forward to seeing what all questions and answers come about.
Thanks, Amy. And so it's Amy that might be the first person to see a question that you ask us later. If you want to send questions to our editions mailbox, editions@neh.gov, she'd be the one that would see them and direct them. You can certainly send questions to me, Jason Bofetti, jbofetti@neh.gov, or Suha Kutsia, who's you'd also find her on the website. If you I didn't put the names up, maybe we can put them in the chat email addresses. But anyway, thanks all for being here. Like I was just saying, a couple of you joined. This is being recorded and will be reposted, but we'll be answering your questions in the order we receive them. Amy Trotter will be reading them off, and then I'll try to answer them, or Suha will try to answer them. So let's start it off then. If anyone has any initial questions they want to ask about the program based on the things that we already put up a webinar, you may have questions about the webinar or questions that weren't covered there. So I see some of you have even come prepared to post questions in. So we'll see now from Amy if she can answer MK's questions, or at least some of them.
Sure, I'll read them out for you guys. The first question is if it's impossible to employ part-time, to be employed part-time by a university and also be the project co-director and for a translation project.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. So the idea is whether you can be a part-time employee. We don't really check or need to know your exact status with respect to whatever institution's applying. You don't even have to technically be employed as a permanent employee at an organization to be a project director. So if you're working part-time, and then you're also the co-director or director, as long as the applicant institution is willing to have you serve in that capacity, has an agreement with you to do that. The main thing is that you can't commit 100% of your time to all your activities. So you do have to think a little bit about if you're still going to be teaching or working part-time, make sure that you're not also suggesting that you're going to be working 100% time on the project.
Okay, a little bit of a backup to that is, does the project director or co-director need to be employed by the university by the time the application is submitted, or by the time the project starts?
You don't have to be. I mean, in the sense that the person could be coming on to the project, as long as the institution is willing to support the project and is willing to sort of vouch for the fact that you will be able to be the project director. it's always important to remember that the applicant is the institution. So in theory, any institution could replace a project director with our permission. So they'd have to go through a process where they'd have to ask us if they could change a project director. So there's always the backup that if you were to, if the applicant institution were to receive an award, and something happened with the employment arrangement and you had to change project directors or step down, that could usually be done before the award is even processed. That's probably the best time to make that kind of change before we put all the paperwork together. But the idea is that by the time the award starts, which would be no earlier than October 1st of that year, after it's funded, you'd have to have sort of those things in place. And the sooner the better, because it takes about a month for our grant staff from September 1st, furiously trying to get everything done before that October 1st deadline in some cases. So there is a small window you could make changes to a project if for some reason the person could not serve. But I think what your question is, do you have to actually be employed at that moment of application? And technically, no.
Great, thank you. Also, should the applying organization, university, institution be considered the primary performance site location, even if the work's being done elsewhere?
Correct. I guess for the sake of the forms that we use, a performance site location is the applicant institution.
All right. A little more general question. Can you define what a scholar is in terms of it being a requirement for a project director or co-director?
Yeah, I think you need to make a case in the application for whether you're a scholar. The point is that it should be someone whose knowledge of the person or the corpus that's being presented is such that they would be an expert on that material. So it doesn't require that you have a PhD per se. It may even be if the person has a PhD, but they're in engineering and they want to do a translation project on history person. They might be a scholar in the sense that they are a scholar in engineering, but we would need to have an explanation of how are you a scholar of the subject matter. Did you want to add anything to that, Suha?
I agree, actually. That's a good point. The experience, training, the kind of publication. I mean, if the project is on math and one of the team members or the co-director is an expert on math, then it makes sense that, their experience would be directly related to the text. But if it is on history, the text itself that will be edited or translated is a historical document or is a document on history or philosophy or religion, the director and co-director should be actually experts on the subject matter, as Jason mentioned.
All right, thank you.
Go ahead, Amy.
In regards to our requirement to have significant and continuous work on the project, would you consider 2 to 3 months of project director's work, even if it's continuously spread out over the course of a year, to be enough?
It's probably going to be a judgment call. I think the point is that we don't want someone stepping away for large periods where they're doing other things entirely. The idea is that you're sort of involved on a day-to-day, weekly basis with the project. And so I do think that there would be cases where, where 2 to 3 months broken up might not really be continuously involved. It would be something we would ask the panel, is this seem, so that's sort of a judgment, I think, about whether the person is involved enough. What we don't want someone is sort of someone who's helicoptering in for a couple days, but then not being involved the rest of the time. I think we want the person who's leading the project really to be spending a lot of time. Although we don't want to define it too harshly because then it gets to be, takes all kinds of discretion out of our hands. But I think you need to make a strong case that you're involved a lot. Suha?
Yeah, the director basically runs the project, and he or she or they are responsible for ensuring that deadlines are met, reports are submitted, work is done. So there would be, it's difficult to define it, to define this in terms of specific hours, but they need to be all, hands-on and, following up on what other people are doing. So that position carries a lot of responsibility.
Let me sort of add, by just in case anyone has any questions about this general point, which is, if you have a question related to like, is this project that I want to do sound like it would be competitive in this program? This probably isn't the format for that kind of question. We'd rather talk to you one-on-one about your project and details. The humanities is a wide area, and some things are more competitive than others, but I think that's a better conversation to have separately. In case anyone was thinking about asking a question that's really more specifically about the subject matter of your project. Let's save that for a sort of our own conversation.
Thanks, Jason. Our next question is regarding budget. If some line items in the budget become redundant throughout the course of the project, could these be kind of split up across different line items?
Yeah, question comes up quite a bit, or at least it comes up frequently. Not for every project, but the idea is that you need to spend money on the project on areas that you've already requested funding. So we can give approval for things that might, so say if you had no travel plan for the project, and then you suddenly decide, well, we didn't use money for this editing activity, we want to use it for travel. That would be something you'd have to ask permission from us directly about, because it's not a category of the grant that you submitted. However, if you already had travel planned and you want to do more of it, so you already had some lines about travel and you want to add some or change some, those are things you could theoretically do without getting our permission. However, there are rules about how much of that you can do, the percentage of time. And I don't want to go into the details of what percent, but what's better is to use the categories and stick within the categories. So there's things like travel, consultants, that sort of thing. Work within the categories of the budget you submitted. And if you have to go beyond that, then you'd have to get permission from us to change those things. Okay, what's the next question, Amy?
This is the last question from this participant. Regarding having participants in the grants that are from other academic institutions, can they be brought in as consultants, or is it better for them to be as integral parts of the actual grant?
In some ways, that's sort of a kind of budget question that comes down to what the language of their arrangement is. So it may be that even though someone is really integral personnel, they may still be listed as a consultant just because they're being paid from your institution directly to that person, but they're not at that institution. So in that way, they're a consultant. It's probably more of a budget question. You need to ask someone in our budget office which part of the budget to put them in. It shouldn't, though, be a reflection on the substance of what they do. That's more of an accounting problem than it is more of a project problem. I think you can put them in where they need to go. So, for example, if you had a subaward, so if your institution gives money to another institution and then they're listed there as, say, the co-PD, that at least reflects a kind of institutional arrangement. If you put them in as a consultant, what you're saying is my institution is going to give them money directly, or at least work with them to pay them directly somehow. But I don't think the reviewers would look at that and say, well, that means they're not very important or integral because they're a consultant. That's more of an accounting name where they ought to go, as opposed to their role. Hope that answers it. Did you have any follow-ups on that, Suha?
No, that's actually a good explanation. It is kind of an accounting matter, and if they are consultants, then you can add them under salaries, and then pointing out, or if there is a category for consultants, field for consultants, then you can add them there.
Yeah, and I would say that maybe like a higher level question is like, does it look better to have people on the project that have academic appointments versus people who might be independent scholars? And I would say there's categorically no preference for people, whether they are, because there's some very good translators who are independent contractors, and there are some very good scholars who work at other institutions you might want to involve, even if they're not at your own, and you have to call them a consultant. I would still go with the strength of the applicant with the consultant and provide their CV. Make sure that it can be easily understood why they're qualified, even if you don't have all the space in the application to discuss their qualifications. Someone can then go down and see, okay, they're an independent scholar, but this is a very impressive resume, so that should be enough.
All right, thanks. The next question is regarding a bit of eligibility. If a project has already received a non-academic translation, but has not yet received a critical edition, would the non-academic translation that was done prior render it ineligible?
It's a good question. No. Generally, what we say is you need to explain what is already out there in the world for a translation, because many things have been translated. Some things have been translated many times, but are no longer up to modern standards. So it's not a question of whether there's not an existing translation. I think you'd simply make the case this translation is potentially very good for a public audience, but lacks critical apparatus, isn't technically as sound as ours would be. I don't think certainly would not make your project ineligible. You just have to explain the need for a critical edition. I mean, that's the other side of it, is you need to make a case that this has not been in a critical edition before, and scholars are looking for that because they need more information than the current translations provide.
I'm sorry, I should clarify that the prior translation would have also been done by the same scholars that are applying for the new edition.
So they're working from their own translation, like they're not doing a new
Yes,
translation. What do you
correct.
think about that, Suha? If they already have translated the work, but now they want to make it as a critical edition.
Technically, it would be eligible. It depends on the strengths of the annotations, the extent of research, introductory essays, or documents to be added. Even if it was translated, something was translated like 5 years ago, but I want to improve it and make it better and add notes. That would be of greater, that would help scholars use the new translation in their own research to generate new works and scholarship, then that would strengthen my proposal for funding. And would make my application more competitive. Of course, I would, as Jason mentioned, I need also to explain what was missing from the translation I did 5, 10, or 10 years ago, why I want to prepare a new one. So that's also important. And clarifying the significance of the text, why it is important to provide a new translation, and how other scholars would be using it, and how they can benefit from it, is also important.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Shifting gears a little bit, can you talk about what kind of information we're looking for specifically with draft submissions?
Yeah, I mean, we do describe what we want there to be in the draft. There's a section in the notice of funding opportunity that tells you what to talk about. The main thing is that it's not meant to be a full, whatever, 10, 12 pages that you would normally have provided to us. It's meant to essentially be a rough draft of kind of the main points of an application. And so you don't need to provide us all the information. I think the most important thing, though, is really making the best case you can for the significance of the text. So especially if you're coming to us for the first time, that it should be clear how scholars will use this edition or translation for new scholarship. Make a case for that, because I think if it can't get past that, it doesn't really matter whether everything else is perfect. You have the right people, you have the right methodology. If you haven't made a case in that initial draft that you can make a good argument for significance and the need for this text as a critical edition or translation, then I think that's probably the most of what we'll end up telling you is like, I don't feel convinced by this argument. Can you improve it in these ways? So think about how to make the best case in that draft so that you at least get past that first hurdle. And if you don't have everything else figured out yet for your draft, that's okay. But we might raise a few points, make sure you do this, make sure you do that. But really, it's I think that's the case. What do you think, Suha? Is that how you've kind of been reading drafts or seeing drafts?
The onus is on the project director to demonstrate and explain how the text can be, be it the edition or translation, how it can be foundational in to the humanities. So some applications deal with well-known texts. That's making the case of significance would be easy, but then there are also unknown, let's say, unfamiliar and non-famous works. So it's the responsibility of the project director and the team themselves to explain and convince the panelists that this would be actually a foundational text once it is published, be it digitally or in print, and that other scholars will be using it to generate new scholarship when the translation or edition is made available.
All right, thanks. Our next question is about the narrative portion of the application, specifically the significance and impact. It says that the requirement is 2 pages where they're asked to provide information on significance and impact. Could 4 pages be submitted?
Yeah, I mean, we give suggested lengths for the narrative, and it's not a requirement in the sense that if you go beyond or don't or fall short somehow, that'll impact the evaluation. It's more of a question of pacing yourself so that you leave yourself enough space in the application to answer all parts of it. I mean, you don't want to come up short because we do have, guidance for the font size and whatever, so you can't shift that around. So if you do spend more time in that section, you might shortchange yourself a little by the end sections. But I would say, in my own work, and I think all of us recognize this, if you end up writing a first draft that's 15 pages, you probably will be well served to figure out how you can condense it anyways, how to edit smartly and get it down to what it has to be, which is no more than 12. Suha, did you have any follow-up to that?
No, what you mentioned is actually very good and helpful. I have nothing to add about this point. 12 pages is a lot of space to fill up with all the information that, to make the case for significance, explain the methods for editing and methods for editorial policies and translation policies. Explain the skills of the team and the outcome of the project and so on. So you have lots of space to fill up, and 12 pages is sufficient to make the case for the application.
And it doesn't have to be. The other thing I like to tell people is that, I think I said this in the webinar, if you're short of 12 pages, that's still okay as long as you've covered the material. We're not requiring you to get full 12 pages out, but.
And it is single space, so not double space of 12 pages. So just remember that.
Also, kind of in the same vein, the bibliographical essay that we require, is it better to cover the proposed texts that they'll be using or to cover texts that have been published previously by the author that's applying?
Let me see. I'm trying to understand the question. Do I answer it right? about the bibliography, right? Who asked the question? Where was
Yes,
that one?
this question is coming from Andrew Krebel, and I can read it exactly
Oh
as he
yeah, I
wrote
see
it.
it now.
Okay.
Yeah, so you're talking about comparing the bibliographical essay to the go ahead and go. Let's see. Why don't we just read it out? Read it out for me, Amy.
Okay. Is the expectation that the bibliographical essay is specific to the proposed texts rather than the author more generally?
Go
The
ahead,
author of
Sue.
the
Do you have a
text,
question? Do you have an answer?
I think he's typing, so we might get some clarifying information here of what he's asking.
Well, the introductory essay would be related to the text plus the author of the text or the authors of the text. The introductory essay would provide contextualize the historical period, the significance of the text. If you're asking about whether the project director has published on the text and whether that information
Right.
should go into the introductory essay. That is possible, but don't overdo it. Leave that to the some parts to leave that leave some parts to the resume section. Focus on the latest publications in relation to the text, and you can mention them, and then add the rest in the resume.
You mean the bibliography?
Oh, sorry, in the bibliography, and then also the rest in the resume.
I mean, I think that part of what you're asking, like if it's a famous figure, you don't want to have to explain the entire history of that figure's importance bibliographically. But I think usually if you're doing a specific text, maybe a text that hasn't been translated or had edition before, it is better, I think, to focus on the reasons why we need a critical edition of that text and where the problems with interpreting that figure have come because of the lack of information about that. So, for example, we funded this last round a project on Whitman, right? And they're focused on the later writings of Whitman as opposed to the Leaves of Grass. So they would want to focus more on the bibliographic material about his later writing and why a new corpus of his later writing helps to understand him better. So they don't try to tell us everything about Whitman and why Leaves of Grass is important and why they really focused on that, on the importance of that particular text or that corpus of texts, and why answering some questions need an addition of those texts.
All right,
Go
thank
ahead,
you.
Amy.
Shifting gears a little bit, we have an applicant who has a project that has components that include some digitization. And as most of us know, we do have restrictions that do not allow for that. Specifically, cannot develop new digital tools or the purchase of computers or peripherals that cannot be included in your application. And so they're wondering if their application that does have some digitization components be eligible, and also as a kind of second part to that, could they also submit this application to the Office of Digital Humanities as well?
Yeah, and I see that there's like a follow-up comment by Steve at 10:59 about not wanting to fall between grants. I mean, there are two things here. One is that when you don't want to apply to two different NEH programs with essentially the same project, because what will happen is the second one that we receive will get rejected as ineligible by our grants office because they'll say it's overlapping work plan, overlapping activities. It's not eligible. So there's that. So I do think it's really necessary if you have a project that you might be applying to two different programs or two different divisions, that you talk to program officers in both divisions and make them aware that you're talking to program officers in both divisions. Try to coordinate a little bit what parts of the grant you want to apply to one division for and what parts you want to apply for the other. And that to me is a better strategy if you're concerned about whether some of the activities of your project really are more for one division and some are really more for another. Is you could put in two applications. Obviously, the fear is that you will get one and not the other, and then where are you? But that's the problem. That's just a problem with grants in general. I mean, sometimes you don't get all the grants you hope you get for the project that you want to do. But the larger question is of prohibitive or allowed activities. And what you're describing is, um, I mean, this is an editing and translation program. So the primary activities need to be for that. In the dark history of the past, dark in my own memory of it, the problem was we would get projects that were really about developing the ability to do a translation or edition online because there was really not that much out there. And those were just there's so much to evaluate just technology wise that we wanted to discourage those. And we still don't want to be funding the startup of new sort of ways of doing editing. What we want to be doing is funding the editing itself. Sometimes you have to develop something in order to do what you want because every project may need a little customization, but we want to keep that on the low end of the project goals and not have the project be primarily we have a new idea about how digital editing could be done and we want money. We have this pilot text we want to use to do it. That to me is not what we want to be funding. We want to be funding projects that are aimed primarily at creating an edition or translation that might require some tweaking of some existing tools or software for the purposes of the project, but that's not the main focus of the project. Suha, do you have any follow-up on that?
Yeah, I would suggest to break down the kinds of activities. So if there are digital activities like building a tool, an online tool, the discussion about the choice of technology and platform, the IT team, etc., and then separate them from the editing and translating activities. So you can prepare an application for us, for our program, that focuses on editing and translation or translation, and another application you can submit it to for example, to the Office of Digital Humanities that focuses really on the digital components and digitization of the project. So in this case, the activities and expenses do not overlap. And you can submit both applications to other funding agencies as well, if you'd like.
Yeah, I would just say I would follow up with Steve, please come to us separately and talk to us about this in the next couple of weeks, because I think your question is specific about visualizations and things I see there, and I don't want to miss what you're trying to do with TEI, MEI, but I think it might be something we would have to break it up a little bit.
All right, thanks. Next question is there a minimum amount for funding request?
A minimum amount? No, not technically. I mean, if you're going to come to us for like $5,000, it might be, that might be too little. Certainly projects, we see projects that don't come to us for the full 300, it might be 180,000 for 3 years, and that's fine. I mean, if that's what you need, for 3 years and you don't need the full amount, I think we appreciate the candor and the savings because it allows us to fund more projects. So I wouldn't worry about that. And again, I mean, you could have, if it's a small enough project where really it's a one-person operation, you might consider applying for a fellowship as opposed to one of these awards, because you can still apply for a translation project if it's one person to the fellowships program for a year's support at 65,000. Is it 65? No, 60,000.
All right, thank you. The next question is, would you would we consider a project that publicizes transcriptions versus translations?
Preparing a critical edition to be published. Maybe I need a little more. So if it's a transcription of something, so theoretically you're describing as a project that might be in another language and you're not translating it. Is that correct? Is that the sense of the question?
That's
That
how I
was,
perceive the question,
yeah.
yes.
So, because all projects have to be critical editions in that it can't just be a straight transcription. It has to be more than transcription of a text, no matter what the language. There needs to be critical apparatus, introductions, possibly endnotes, footnotes, bibliography, that sort of thing to be a competitive project. But if a project is left in the original language, if it's not translated into English at all, it's just a transcription from, say, French, and it's not going to be translated into English, you need to tell us or explain why there's not a need for a translation. Potentially that's because scholars would want to read it in the original French, don't need a translation at the level of French, or it's not such a antiquated version of French that they would need someone to guide them through it. So, but I do think it's important to make the case, and I think we either say that in the guidelines or will the next time, because it's come up recently, to make a case for not needing a translation if it's in a foreign language. Suha?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think according to the question, the language, the original language is Spanish. It depends on the significance of the project, what the panelists would think about, would evaluate how they would appreciate the project and what they think of it. But there is a need actually to explain why a translation is not necessary and just a transcription is enough.
And the other way to do it
Mhm.
too is to say, well, this first phase, we're not translating it, but we intend a future translation, and be very upfront about the fact that that is another stage of the project. This is just the first phase, if that's the plan.
Great, thank you. Is it acceptable to partner with scholars outside of the United States?
Yes, we certainly encourage international collaboration. I do think we say in the NOFO, the guidelines, that you need to make a case for why it's an enhancement to the project to do that. So discuss the involvement of international participants and why you're doing it. That way, it's some demonstration of need for expertise, desire for international cooperation, and why someone who's close at hand wouldn't be able to do the job just as well.
Great, thank you. Our next question is regarding the sample portion of the application, which is limited at 35 pages. It's a two-part question. The first part is, in the samples that are provided there, could they provide annotations that are more theoretical, for instance, what they would look like in the final version, versus this are the ones that we're actually going to publish? And the second part of this question is, can they use the full 35 pages? Or is there a reason to not use the full 35 pages?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that we recognize, since everybody, even those who are coming to us again, have to project what future things are going to look like. So you're doing something that you will be doing during the project. What you're going to present us with might not be exactly what it will be in the end. What I think the reviewers need and what we need is some sense of what types of things you're going to annotate, and have it be reflected of an annotation policy of some kind, even if it's not the final thing that you do. But like, what's a bad thing is we get 3 pages of sample, there are 2 footnotes, and that's all we get. And they're 2 very small footnotes. We have no idea if that's as light as it's going to be annotated. I mean, there are things that are called for lighter annotation, but I think it should be somewhat representative, if not, it doesn't have to be exactly what the final version will be. So don't worry too much about the exactitude. we have a cap because when we didn't have a cap, we would get like 100 pages of samples and it was just crazy. So we decided to make a cap of 35. I don't think you need to use 35 pages, but there are circumstances where a project might be giving us the original sample, which is a really gigantic text, then a transcription, then a translation, then the digital example, right? Those are cases where you're probably going to need all 35 to show all those different stages of the edition. And so that's part of why it's as high as 35, but I don't think you need 35 in cases where it's a straightforward, here's the text and here's the annotated sample of the edition in English. So I guess I'm telling you, no, you don't need to use all 35 and don't push it just to get to 35.
Thanks, Jason. Our next question is regarding the work plan. If you have a colleague that you're working with overseas, and you're only going to be spending 2 to 3 months together face to face to work on the project, but you'll both be working independently outside of that time frame, is that acceptable?
Yes. And even I would go further and say you probably should justify why you even need to be doing face-to-face at all these days. I'm not saying it's not important, and I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm just saying that that's a question sometimes we'll get from reviewers is, do they really even need to get together? So just make it clear that there's a phase in the process that you want to sit together and need to be in the same room working on it, and then there's a justification for why you would be not need to be there present together. So it's more to me, it's been more of an issue of justifying the face to face than justifying the non face to face in this age of Zoom and Teams. You want to add anything to that, Suha?
No, but what you mentioned is very helpful, and I have nothing to add at this point.
Okay, our next question, let's see. I'm going to read it as written. It says, I am preparing a critical edition and translation to be published separately as a paperback. The translation obviously has a wider audience for undergraduate teaching, general readers, etc. Is the wider audience and the pedagogical usefulness relevant here, or should the proposal be focused squarely on the scholarly impact?
Yeah, I think you should. I think you should put up front, prioritize the scholarly impact, even though I think you could certainly discuss how it's going to be used in the classroom and used by public audience, because I find that the worry would be is this primarily for a public audience and primarily for the classroom? Because if it is, then I think it's not gonna do as well on these panels. I think they'd rather see you sort of be committed and go full commitment to scholarly usage as the primary purpose. And it's certainly the case that we see projects where there'll essentially be two editions of the product. One will be the scholarly edition with all the bells and whistles and the annotations, and then there might be even a published paperback that doesn't have any of those things, but it's much cheaper and it's more readily available. And I think reviewers, and we certainly see that as a great way of getting more bang for the buck, so to speak, and reaching more audiences with it.
Thanks, Jason. We have one more question in the chat, unless anyone else would like to drop theirs in. And this question is, can a person be co-director on multiple NEH funded projects? Will having an NEH grant for one project limit your chances in a pool for a different application or project?
Yeah, I was looking at some of our guidance on that in our FAQs, because what we essentially want to say is that we don't want someone to be a project director in this program for more than one at a time. Now, being a co-director on multiples poses a little bit more of a challenge, because I don't think we want to discourage people or keep people from being able to be a co-director on more than one project. But we do actually say in our FAQs that we don't want people to be co-directors either of another scholarly additions project at the same time. Now, if you're talking about other divisions programs or even other research division programs, you could be a co-director on another NEH project at the same time you're a co-director on a scholarly additions project. But I think we want to make sure that you're not spreading yourself too thin and really able to dedicate time to these projects which we consider to be intellectually intensive. And so I don't know that it limits your chances because no one's going to know that you're in another pool who's on the project unless you tell them that in the application that you're also a co-director on these other projects. But I do think it might take a little bit away from the importance to you, of the perception of the importance to you or the person, if you're involved in lots of projects at the same time.
All right, thank you. If for some reason I skipped over your question or you have another question that has not been included in the chat, please feel free to drop it in now. Otherwise, I believe that's it for our questions.
Okay, great. Yeah, so like I said, this has been recorded, and if everything goes according to plan, we'll be posting it with these questions and answers. I don't think the chat is recorded. Is that true? Amy, do you know whether the chat ends up coming? It doesn't go into the final
Correct.
version. Yeah.
Correct. The chat will not be included in the video and
Yeah.
or the transcription. Yep.
Yeah, so you could go back and watch this if you wanted to see what your answer was again, but you won't see your own question anywhere except that it was read out. So, and again, I think the other thing to tell you too, if you're still with us, if you have other questions, specific questions to your project, please don't hesitate to reach out directly to myself or to Suha. And we do have a draft deadline the end of next week on the 22nd. It's due by the end of the day, by midnight. And then again, we'll get those back to you before the end of October is the plan. And that way you still have a few more weeks to work on it, where the deadline is November 29th, I believe, a Wednesday, November 29th. Whatever I say is preempted by what's actually in the guidelines, but I believe that's the case. So so thanks all for joining us. I appreciate your time, and we hope to get an application from you.
Thank you, everyone. And please contact Jason or myself if you have any questions. We'll be very happy to help you and talk about your project and see in what way we can, you can improve it. Thank you so much.